Good afternoon, or perhaps morning, wherever you are. And as Director of Strategy at Resilience First, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar organised by Resilience First in conjunction with the National Infrastructure Commission. Resilience First mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. Please do visit our website, resilience1st.co.uk, to see the many projects and events we organise in an effort to help your understanding and application of resilience. We have recently formed a strategic partnership with the Resilient Shift organisation, so perhaps our reach and output have expanded for the greater good. Now, today's webinar is centred around the baseline report released by the National Infrastructure Commission on the 15th of November last year. As its name suggests, the report sets the parameters for the second NIC Assessment Report, which will be published eventually in the second half of 2023. To start the journey, a call for evidence was included in the launch, which will remain open until the 4th of February, and I do encourage you to take part. Now, the baseline and assessment reports are key to helping steer the UK government into making the right investment decisions. And around 80% of the recommendations in the first NIC assessment report were accepted by the government. It is therefore important that we understand the factors around the review and make the voices of business known in any evidential material. By way of introduction, the baseline report introduces three strategic themes for study. First, reaching net zero. Second, adapting to climate change and reducing environmental impacts. And third, supporting levelling up across the regions. He's also identified 6 national systems to be considered. Those are digital, energy, flood resilience, water and wastewater, waste and transport. So there is much to analyse and discuss. And I hope this webinar will provide attendees with the opportunity to hear from the NIC directly, as well as listen to expert commentators on aspects of the report and the likely implications for business. Now, I will shortly invite Basil Scarcella, the CEO of UK Power Networks, to begin proceedings. And after some opening remarks, Basil will introduce our 3 speakers this afternoon. Throughout the session, I encourage all of you listening to ask questions of the speakers by posting your brief questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. And I'm sure the chair will include as many as he can in the Q&A session towards the end of the session. Lastly, I should add that the proceedings are being recorded and we will share an edited summary as well as the slides used in the next few days. A copy of the NIC baseline report and the call for evidence will also be included. So having said that, Basil, the virtual floor is yours, and thank you to everyone.
Robert, thank you for that comprehensive introduction, and welcome everyone that's online. I'm Basil Scarcella. I have the pleasure this afternoon to chairing what he promises to be a very interesting discussion on the recently published baseline report by the National Infrastructure Commission, which is chaired by the highly respected Sir John Armitt. And anything that Sir John Armitt puts his hand to is worth reviewing and is worth taking note of. So today, fortunate I think we have 3 excellent speakers that will take us through the next hour. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. Then we will spend about another quarter of an hour or so with a panel discussion. And finally, we'll spend the last 15 minutes endeavouring to answer the questions that the audience, as Robert has already indicated, hopefully will ask through the chat line, which you can see on your screen, the icon on the top right-hand corner. The first one of our speakers this afternoon is Bridget Rosewell. Bridget, CBE, is a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, but importantly, she's also a member of the National Infrastructure Commission, and Bridget will provide an overview of the baseline report. Following Bridget's presentation, we have Catherine Ross. Catherine is Regulatory Affairs Director at Thames Water. Prior to that, she was the CEO of Ofwat, the water regulator here in the UK. And based on the current job and the previous job, Catherine will give us a regulatory perspective of the baseline report. Finally, the final speaker is Rachel Skinner, CBE. Rachel is an executive director of WSP Global, a Canadian consulting organisation, and Rachel will finally talk to us about the sustainability perspective of the report. As I say, please feel free to contribute questions as the speakers go through the messages, and we'll come back towards the end to, like I say, endeavour to answer your questions. So to kick us off, Bridget, welcome.
Thank you very much, and for that introduction and for the opportunity to help encourage more and more people to make a contribution to our evidence base. Robert's already given a pretty comprehensive introduction to the assessment, but I'll try and put a bit more flesh on those bones. And is the presentation there? Because I can't see it at the moment, Robert. Ah, excellent. Okay, so just to start, before I go into any more detail, a little bit of the background to this. So this is the second National Infrastructure Assessment. The first one was published in 2018. It took the government a little bit longer than they were supposed to. They were supposed to respond within a year. It took them more like 2. But there were some elections and changes of government in the interim. So I guess they had some excuses. And then, so finally, last year, we had the publication of the National Infrastructure Strategy, which was essentially the overarching response to our first assessment. Although, you know, to be fair, there have been quite a lot of bits and pieces, if you like, along the way, and response to individual aspects of our recommendations, and I'll mention some of those in a moment or two. And I think that there's been a fair amount of progress in thinking about these issues. The hydrogen strategy, heat and building strategy, transport decarbonisation strategy, accelerating the date for phasing out petrol and diesel car and van sales was a recommendation that we made and that has been accepted, that's brought it forward 5 years. And I think also some of the thinking that we've done around transport and some of the particular studies, we do these 5-yearly assessments, but we also do a whole number of interim studies on particular topics. And those have ranged from batteries to 5G, to Crossrail 2, to rail needs assessment in the Midlands and the North, to freight, to regulation, to resilience. Yeah, the list goes on. And the current one, which consultation has just closed on, is a surface water flooding. So maybe in all probability, some of you have already responded to that consultation. And we do an annual monitoring report, which looks at government's record in responding to our recommendations and indeed then acting on them, because those are not quite the same thing. And one of the things that we're particularly saying is we need to move from agreeing recommendations and having a strategy to actually having an action plan and a financial strategy behind that. We need to give clarity to investors, regional local partners, and making the supply chains, giving supply chains confidence to be ready. And I'm sure business will have some inputs into those kind of issues, getting that certainty of what a delivery schedule might look like. And we know that it can work. So I think it's worked well in the context of digital, for example, and getting the 5G rollout and getting a broadband picture, which is actually pretty good across the country. Could be better, but it is pretty good. But there are still big issues, say, around a market for engineered greenhouse gas removals. We've just completed a study on that. And it needs to get going at pace too. And how we roll out and bring down the cost of heat pumps if we're really going to transition to low carbon heating, both for domestic and indeed industrial sectors. So our baseline report looks back at what's been achieved, those sorts of issues, but then tries to give an up-to-date assessment of where we are and what we think the issues are that we really need to look at. We're relatively small, so we're not going to look at everything. And you may well think that if there are gaps in what we've suggested are priorities that you think really matter, then if we do more work on one thing, we have to drop back on doing something else. And that's one of the kind of strategic and indeed tactical decision making that we try and keep up to date with at commission meetings all the time. Our budget is around 5 million a year. It's not big potatoes. And we don't make the decisions about actual delivery, don't forget. We're giving advice. But we've got that forward look. We're thinking 30 years forward. We're thinking about trying to bring those things together and avoid the cutting into silos. It's really hard to avoid the cutting into silos, I have to say, because Whitehall is silos supreme, and delivery systems tend to be siloed also. So there's still those significant and urgent gaps, and that's what we're trying to focus on. And so we looked at the 6 sectors that Robert mentioned. Those are the ones in our remit: energy, water, digital, roads, waste, and heating, floods. It's around the digital, water, waste, floods, transport, energy. Energy is clearly an issue which spreads across absolutely everything. You can't deliver water without electricity because you need to pump, and so on. So there's some really big cross-cutting things, and it's those in particular that we're also trying to pull together. And our areas of concern are very much around that heating question I've already mentioned, floods, surface water we're looking at. There are 5 million properties in England at risk. What do we think about water quality, rivers? All of these are issues that have come up the agenda, the public agenda, very strongly recently. And urban transport is an issue that's really come through a lot in the work we did on towns, I beg your pardon. So all of that has pulled together into our 3 themes, and these are sort of the way that fits together, the 3 themes and those particular issues within them. So we've got reaching net zero, clearly one of the significant challenges, and Rachel, I'm sure, will have some things to say about that. But resilience to climate change, adaptation is also being an issue, and how that pulls into air quality and asset management, waste, and those sorts of issues. And then levelling up, interurban transport, urban mobility, and the digital transformation aspects to that. And within each of those, then there are some sort of sub-issues that in each case that we're looking at. So just in very briefly, some words around each of our themes. So net zero, then clearly electricity generation is one of the things that we're going to be particularly focused on. We're looking at that rather than the distribution issues, which I'm sure Basil has got a lot to say about and to think about, because there's a lot of work going on in that area at the moment. How do we decarbonise electricity generation and improve at the same time as delivering a secure supply and limiting impact on consumers? And clearly that's an issue that's right at the top of many people's agenda at the moment. It was on top of our agenda before all of the recent increases in prices, but that has definitely brought into focus, particularly the distributional aspects of some of this. Who pays? Is it the consumer or is it the taxpayer? In the end, people pay, but how that's distributed depends a lot on whether it's people, the users, who are going to pay, for changes in electricity generation, or whether it's distributed more broadly by putting it through the taxation system. And we're going to be looking at some of those aspects. Hydrogen. Is hydrogen the answer? Carbon capture and storage networks associated potentially with hydrogen. If we start with blue hydrogen, is it really feasible to get to green hydrogen? What are the water requirements for green hydrogen? Can we get those? Is a distribution network going to work for, say, HGVs to be to be hydrogen powered? And so there's a lot of issues around that. And we looked at that specifically in our engineered greenhouse gas removals report, which came out at the back end of last year, one of our special reports that we were asked to do. And then there's heat pumps. How are we going to roll out heat pumps, and with what speed can we do that across the whole country? It's not the same as changing from coal gas to a North Sea gas, because the energy content of a heat pump is less. Their location, the way that the radiators work are all different. I'm doing some personal research on this at the moment in what I can do in my own property. So how are we going to manage that transition, what the options are, and the speed is something that is a particular personal interest, but I think everybody is finding it more and more interesting. So those are the particular things we're going to look, we think, are our focus under that reaching net zero theme. The second one, climate resilience and the environment. And again, we've seen some big issues in this space. You know, Storm Arwen in the north was those of us in the north think that would have got a lot more publicity had it happened in the south. But trees down, you couldn't get to the substations, you couldn't get to the water pumping stations in order to get the water pumped again, and then rain, flood, and all of those. So how are we going to increase our resilience to extreme weather? And how do we think about what is effectively in many places an aging infrastructure network? And that's we see that with landslips on the rail network. We see it in floods from sewers. We see it in pipe work systems, which date back to the 19th century. 150 years old is some of our significant infrastructure. It stood up really well, actually, when you think about it, but every good thing comes to an end. And again, what sort of recommendations should we be making about asset condition, maintenance, the boring bits, if you like? No, it's not exciting cutting ribbons on new stuff. It's how do you make sure, and what's the spend associated with making sure that assets are maintained in a good condition. And so that focus on the existing is one of the things that we're going to be particularly looking at. And that's our surface water study that we're already working on is important in that. I'm particularly interested again in levelling up and in a circular economy, and how we can think more about that and what that means for both asset management and whole life, thinking about things on a more whole life basis. So we'll be thinking about what the aspects of that are. And our third theme is really around supporting levelling up. It's been added to our objectives. We've done the town study recently, but we also looked at cities specifically in our first national infrastructure assessment. We've done some work around behaviour change and scenarios. We don't know yet how people are what the long-term response to COVID is going to be. And indeed, whether the extent to which that accelerates changes which were already in place, like people not working on Fridays, for example, working from home on Fridays, and more working from home was a trend that was already in place. It's been accelerated. How much of that is permanent? How much of that is going to go back? We're looking at those in much more a scenario and trying to manage uncertainty place rather than just having a central forecast. And how do we make sure that strategies are made at an appropriate level? So the place where you can bring together infrastructure and all the other aspects which make infrastructure successful, it's necessary, but it ain't sufficient for either a successful economy or successfully improving quality of life. That needs to be done at the right level, whether that's regionally, locally, communities, neighbourhood plans, all of those sorts of things need to be facilitated, but within an overarching framework. So facilitating data collection, data transformation, of use of infrastructure services. How do we think about a surface transport strategy at a high level, which involves thinking about roads and rail, not just roads or rail or active travel, which is how it tends to work at the moment. And so over the next 18 months, we need to take a pretty intensive program of work. We've got 18 months to do this. We've produced the baseline, that's in last year. In the next 18 months, we're doing a lot of research of our own, but also we need to stand on the shoulders of giants. We will try and exploit anybody and everybody who has something to say in this place so that we can produce an assessment which builds as effectively as it can on everybody's information, but also builds a successful consensus on how these things should be pulled together. It's, goodness knows, this isn't easy. We're living in a very changing world. The past is not a guide to the future in anything like the way that it used to be. So I would very much encourage you to get involved. The call for evidence runs till the 4th of February. Feel free to respond to a little bit, all of it. There are, I think, 17 questions that you could answer. Don't feel you have to answer all of them. There are, I think, how many of us are there? 7, 8 commissioners. We've got a staff of about 30. We do not know everything. We will try and get out and about around the country as much as possible, talk to as many people as possible, find the biggest range of views that we can, so that we have a very successful second National Infrastructure Assessment. And I look forward to your help. Thank you.
Bridget, thank you very much. You very short presentation, but you've raised so many subjects that I think we could be spending days discussing it. So thank you and well done. That was a sort of general, obviously, overview. To delve sort of in more specifics, Catherine Ross, as I said earlier, will talk to us about the regulatory perspective of the report. Catherine.
Thanks, Basil. That's brilliant. And thank you, Robert, for inviting me along to talk about this really important and I hope very influential piece of work from the National Infrastructure Commission. So yes, you're right. I'm here to talk a little bit about the regulatory perspective. But the first thing that I think I ought to just put on the record in my opening remarks is to say that regulatory folk, and I speak as a fully paid up regulatory anorak, are often guilty of having a hammer and therefore only seeing nails. And I think it is important to just sort of put on the record the fact that a lot of the things that the NIC are talking about, a lot of the big issues that they're raising, can only be solved by means of companies like mine, like yours, like some of the other participants that we have on the webinar, actually doing a lot of hard yards in terms of delivery. So I think, although I'm here to talk about the regulatory perspective, let's not forget that I think it's the regulated companies who'll be ultimately doing the delivery in conjunction with a lot of other players in the system, which I might talk a little bit about later on. What regulation needs to be doing is laying the groundwork, enabling and encouraging companies to step up, to own these issues, to create the solutions, or perhaps to co-create them with others, and then to crack on and get delivering, because we really don't have very much time for some of this stuff. So let me talk a little bit then about the regulatory perspective on some of the issues that the NIC is quite rightly raising. And I think the headline is that if we are going to be successful in delivering against some of those big challenges that the NIC is setting out, we are really going to have to steam out every last source of efficiency, creativity and innovation that we can. If we're really going to drive the outcomes that customers and society care about, regulation actually is going to have to get to grips with some of the things that historically it's found rather difficult to do in order to enable that efficient delivery to happen. And I think there are 3 challenges I just want to call out, and then we can see maybe if we pick them up in the discussion later on. The first challenge, and this is written right the way through the NIC baseline report, is about long-term thinking. So, I mean, certainly in the water sector, we're hearing a lot more from Ofwat now about long-term thinking, and we're very supportive of that. And I think it's definitely incumbent on companies to think way beyond the end of the next price review and have genuinely sort of 20, 30, 40, perhaps even 50-year strategies and plans for their asset base and how they're going to deliver over the long term. But it's not enough. And I think regulators themselves need to think about what they can do to encourage that long-term planning and facilitate it through the regulatory regime, perhaps setting longer-term regulatory frameworks for delivery that enable regulators and companies together to do some proper long-term planning and sequencing some of this chunky asset investment that may be coming along the line, so that we're not only looking at the investment that we allow to happen in the next 5-year period, but we're making those decisions conscious of the investment that we are seeing coming along down the track in the period after that, and the period after that, and the period after that. And that's not easy for regulators because there are 5-year price reviews. And you often hear regulators talking about how they can't fetter their discretion. And there's some truth in that. But there's some real genuine benefit to be had in terms of unlocking more creativity and also making sure that we deliver all this investment within an inevitable sort of affordability envelope, if there were some proper long-term thinking there within the regulatory regime. And I know at Ofwat, I mean, when I was there, we were trying to encourage companies to put forward long-term incentives for outcome delivery that spanned multiple control periods, and nobody did. So I'm not just putting this at the foot of the regulator to solve. I think it's something companies and regulators should solve together, but the regime does need to be open to change, I think, on that. Second challenge I want to call out is about systems thinking. And again, Bridget referenced this a lot, I think, in her presentation. So just to re-emphasize how important this is, I mean, the outcomes that we are trying to deliver right now in terms of net zero, in terms of climate change resilience and improvement in environmental sustainability, they simply cannot be delivered within the sector silos that the current regulatory regime is structured around. It just isn't possible. I mean, if we're going to deliver, net zero, we don't only need to decarbonize energy, but in the water sector, for example, we need to do more to generate renewable energy ourselves, and we need to reduce demand for water. We need to decarbonize transport, but we also need to move around less and make more use of remote working, which of course requires better communications infrastructure. All this stuff is really linked up. And I have to say, I was really hopeful when I saw the government's national infrastructure strategy last year, when I saw the reference there to government putting out a cross-sector policy statement on net zero, because I think that's exactly the kind of approach that I think might break down some of those silos and encourage some joint thinking and perhaps even some joint delivery between different regulators. I'd be very supportive of that. Maybe we should have some more of those cross-sector policy statements. Maybe something on climate change resilience would be useful. Maybe even something on affordability and vulnerability as well. I think there's definitely scope for a bit of a rethink there. And then I think the third challenge I just wanted to highlight, and I think it's an important one, and to be fair, it is one that regulators have wrestled with for a very long time, is the challenge of innovation. And I think it's a really difficult one for regulators. The regulatory toolkit is really quite good at driving productive efficiency. It's good at driving companies to do what they do in the way that they do it cheaper. Very effective at that. It's got better, I think. It's not bad at incentivizing and encouraging allocative efficiency and encouraging companies to make the best use of scarce resources. And regulators can encourage markets, for example, to help drive some of that allocative efficiency. But innovation, dynamic efficiency, that's something I think the regime has always struggled with a little bit. I mean, there are things that regulators can do and have been doing. So, for example, we've seen Ofgem and also Ofwat latterly develop innovation funds. And I think that has been helpful in sort of prompting a conversation or catalysing some thinking on the part of companies to do things a little bit differently. Certainly at Thames Water, we've been successful in bidding into Ofwat's innovation fund, and it caused us to think differently, not only about a different way of doing things in our production process, in our case in respect of anaerobic digestion, but it also prompted some collaboration between Thames and other companies, which I think is a really good thing as well. So innovation funds can be useful. I mean, another tool in the regulatory toolkit is tough targets. I mean, Ofwat, for example, at PR19 had this sort of mandatory minimum 15% target on leakage reduction for companies. And I know, because I was there at the time, that this came out of immense frustration that companies just weren't thinking differently about how to tackle leakage. And I think that's been proved broadly right. I think companies are doing different things, a broader range of things now to tackle leakage. But, there are still some barriers. There are some sort of missing pieces in the regulatory toolkit. And there are a couple just to highlight. And I think one of them in particular is the need to leave appropriate returns on the table. If, and I think this is an if, we want to see more innovation on the part of the regulated businesses, then I do think the regulatory regime needs to leave sufficient upside on the table for those regulated businesses to compensate them for the downside risks that they're taking when they embark on the innovation, the risks that the thing might not turn out. I think there is a question as to whether it's appropriate for regulated businesses to take on that kind of risk and engage in that kind of innovation. But if that's what you want, then you do need to set the regime up to incentivize the delivery of it. I think there is a bigger question, perhaps a more relevant question on innovation, about the extent to which regulators perhaps need to think a little bit differently about the evidence base that they ask for from companies when they are assessing business plans. And I'm very, very conscious that a lot of that evidence base, necessarily comes from having done stuff that looks a lot like this in the past and having evidence that it works and having evidence about the efficient cost associated with it. But obviously, if you are doing something differently that maybe you haven't done before, you just don't have that evidence base. So perhaps a little bit more creativity about how companies might build successful business cases that didn't necessarily rest on historical evidence about having done that kind of thing in the past would be useful. There are some examples of that. I mean, Ofwat, for example, has allowed companies to do different things in the water production process, for example, using more nature-based solutions. So there is some precedent there, but I think there's still a long way to go. So that's really my take on the baseline report. Some big challenges there, I think, for the regulatory regime collectively. Some green shoots. There is some evidence that I think those challenges can be met. But I think there is a lot of work for regulators and for regulated companies and for investors together to try and co-create some of the solutions to these issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. And it was a bit of a worry as an individual that deals with regulators on a daily basis. For a few minutes, I thought I was dealing with Ofgem. But Catherine, you raise a very interesting equation when you talk about innovation, tough targets, and adequate returns. Again, those three topics could make a long, long conversation, but they are so interrelated that I'm sure there'll be some questions that the audience will ask. So how you balance innovation, tough targets, and adequate returns. So thank you. Our final speaker, Rachel. Rachel's going to talk to us about sustainability. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thank you, similar to the others, for the invitation to join in with this event today. So I wanted to speak, I guess, as briefly as I can, just to offer up three key kind of initial thoughts around the strategic themes that Bridget has spoken about and that the NIC has identified for particular investigation this time around. So I guess my perspective on this is partly informed from the fact that I've been working for many years for one of the bigger international consultancy players in the infrastructure space, with a focus on transport, but also because I have just come away, as I suspect many of you know, from spending a year as president of the Institution of Civil Engineers, where I basically talked about nothing but climate action, and where it does feel that actually I and others have begun to stir up some real change and interest and appetite and awareness and so on in terms of what really needs to be done. Just to kind of dive in slightly, I guess, first of all, I can't tell you how excited I was to see the list of these three themes when the call for evidence and the call for the consultation side of things actually first came out, because I feel very strongly this is exactly the right list in terms of headline topics. And I'm not just saying that because I think these are areas that have been underrepresented for quite some time, and it's really exciting to see that the NIC is now clearly intending to really get to grips with these sorts of big issues. And they really are big, and they are complex, they are highly technical, and I think in the engineering and infrastructure space, sometimes we've been guilty perhaps of assuming that the the more traditional technical work that goes on inside some of the infrastructure sectors is perhaps more important than some of this, where actually we're finding out that mindset is now carrying us into decades of trouble, shall we say. So in my head, all three of these key strategic themes relate to sustainability with a capital S, meaning sustainability defined in its proper big sense across environmental and social and economic side of things. The same definition that's been out there for many, many decades now. So this has to be all about delivering the needs of today's people out there across the country without compromising the potential for tomorrow's generations of people to do exactly the same and to enjoy a decent quality of life and so on. And it's not just about round here. Of course, this is a global problem, but for today, at least, we're talking about the NIC and its immediate and direct reach, I guess. So, I mean, obviously, the environmental piece fits in terms of the two climate action pieces. Obviously, the social piece fits in terms of the levelling up piece and the need to create change and social value, and to me those two elements are just so closely intertwined they almost can't be separated in terms of that social and levelling up space. And the economic piece by definition has to wrap around all of it, because actually the environmental and the social levers behind this are the key enablers of onward economic growth or otherwise for the future. So three kind of as brief as I can thoughts. I'm conscious we're trying to get on to a bit of discussion and questions and so on. First, though, it feels to me that it would be really helpful if through this second national infrastructure assessment, if the NIC could really clearly articulate just how far on the wrong side of this sustainability line we really are at the moment. And that applies whether we're looking at the climate related pieces or the social inequality pieces, the resilience pieces. You can look at it across all the different dimensions of this, because actually we have the same problem across all of those. And that actually really does take us into a position of, I guess, real challenge, but more importantly, perhaps real potential for change that has to start from now. So just to draw on something out of my ICE role over the past year, as I just mentioned, I feel like I spent the entire year just shouting about climate action in terms of both the net zero piece and the resilience piece as loudly as I possibly could, alongside others who are doing the same. And it is great to see that the message around the carbon emissions associated with infrastructure, for example, when you define them very, very broadly across all of the sectors that the NIC is interested in, it does feel that message has landed. However, there is still a massive gap between people hearing that message and beginning to understand it, and really getting on with the scale of change that's actually needed, because we are so far the wrong side of the line right now. And again, this isn't just a UK thing, and we all know that, and it's very easy to fall into a trap of thinking, oh, there's nothing we can do, we're just a small island and all the rest of it. But actually our influence is large, and if we don't take the opportunity to try to have that influence, to try to lead and so on, as clearly, you know, the UK in a political sense is trying to do, then actually the cost of not doing that could be far, far greater than we actually realise. And I think here we're talking about a complete mindset shift in the infrastructure space towards aspects to do with the circular economy, no matter where in the circle we're beginning from. Similar related shifts in terms of natural capital, in terms of biodiversity-led thinking, the critical role in terms of reducing the harm that we continue to do to the world around us in the interim period, essentially. And as we've already heard, some real serious consideration around the energy implications of all of this, to do with now and, you know, next year, or by 2030, by 2050 and so on, as they specifically relate to the whole of infrastructure for the future. Because this isn't just a set of changes for a little special group sitting in the corner. This is an everyone everywhere change if we're going to get anywhere near what we actually need to do. And that leads me, I guess, onto my second thought, which is that we need to figure out how we're going to move from talking about these things and raising awareness and having people sort of getting on board with it, to actually making real change. And this is echoing a point that Bridget made just a few minutes ago. It's really easy to say that, and it's really, really difficult to actually do that, especially at the sort of pace we need to go at if we're going to get onto the right side of the line to do with all three of these different areas. So we are bound to get questions around, you know, how on earth we can afford the scale, that the pace of change that's needed. But I think in my head, we need to be really careful that we don't accidentally end up comparing the cost of carrying on as we are, so the sort of the doing nothing or changing nothing cost and risk profile, against the doing something cost, which might look big when you first see it on paper, but actually that the cost, the risk associated with doing nothing is actually going to be something that clearly increases most likely exponentially in the future. So actually the impacts of doing nothing now have to be considered in relation to that long run picture, not the shall we spend something or shan't we spend something. And I think just linked into that in terms of the government action, in terms of private sector and corporate action and so on, we also just need to be really careful. And I guess in terms of keeping ourselves honest, really, we need to be very, very careful that we are doing everything we can to avoid greenwashing or the pretense of action or, frankly, hot air, which is partly caused by misunderstanding and people not necessarily fully getting to grips with some of the issues. But actually, sometimes, if we are being really honest with ourselves, over recent years has sometimes been somewhat intentional in terms of trying to spin a good story, but not actually, necessarily really making the change that needs to sit behind all of this. I think I just sort of reinforced, though, alongside that, just a point I made just a couple of minutes ago. This isn't just about new market entrants, new technologies, the shiny stuff, if you like, coming in and doing things differently. This is the reality of every single business, public or private sector, everybody who is already working in the infrastructure space in any way and making a contribution in that respect. All of us making real change to support against these three strategic areas that the NIC is now homing in on, because it doesn't work unless we actually try and get everybody pointing in broadly the same direction. So that brings me around to my final thought in this section of the event today, which is that we also have to remember, and this makes it even more complicated, of course, that the goalposts around all of these areas, all of these different dimensions, are not standing still. And somewhat inconveniently, they're not even sitting on different pitches with different teams happily playing in splendid isolation. All of these things, these big environmental, these big social systems, are all in motion all of the time, and they are all interacting with each other in a sort of a big systems sense. And I think, we can see some of this change out there in practice already, but we can also see changes in terms of the way in which we need to get our brains wrapped around these issues coming through as well. And for example, on net zero, we've seen the very recent publication of the SBTI, so science-based targets standard for net zero, which effectively for the first time really gives everybody, in a UN endorsed and enabled kind of a way, much more guidance for all sorts of organizations on what net zero trajectories actually really have to look like and what they really have to mean from now. And we really need to figure out what that actually means, because frankly, it's going to mean that an awful lot of people need to revisit their commitments. They need to think very hard about what it is they're actually promising to do, because in a nutshell, we've got to squash down all of these energy requirements by a massive percentage, as well as moving to more renewable sources as fast as we can. And we're not just talking about a little bit of a reduction and then lots of offset. We're talking about 95% reduction in terms of current emissions and that kind of thing. So this is huge in terms of moving of goalposts, in terms of changing of requirements and that kind of thing. On resilience, I guess the requirements are not yet all that clear. Perhaps the goalposts aren't that clearly focused at the moment, a little bit like Catherine was just saying. And when it comes to the levelling up and social value piece, in theory, it should be pretty well mandated. It is well mandated, but for some reason, it's taking time to actually bring that through. So I think we should be thinking really hard about how we make some of that change come through more quickly, I suppose, in terms of things like the Social Value Act, in terms of things like PPN 620, which in theory starts to, well, from a year ago, started to mandate the use of the government's chosen metrics in terms of the social value and indeed the levelling up piece that should come about. So I guess the key thought there is that all of these areas are interacting, and these goalposts are actually, all over the place, and the rules of the game are simply not going to stay the same. And by definition, we need to really think about the interaction between these things as well as the individual three areas that Bridget has outlined. So I suppose if I was an NIC commissioner, which I'm not, but I suppose I'd be doing everything I can to interrogate these themes. As I said, I think they're exactly the right ones, but then to be confident and brave and bold in terms of answering them and trying to really call out the issues and shine a light on how we work our way through them as quickly as we can. I think collaboration absolutely is going to be key. The systems thinking piece, as we've already heard, absolutely key. And we need this to try to be fiercely evidence-based as far as we can, in order to actually go forward as fast as possible. But I guess just to close, my final thought on that is that it would be really helpful if we could all help to drive as many nails as possible into the coffin around that comparison between doing nothing and doing something, and somehow these set of solutions ending up being things that are dramatically more expensive than perhaps anything else, because in reality we aren't comparing like with like, and we really need to get to grips with what that reality in the future will look like if we don't get on with figuring out how to invest in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I think I dare say that you're talking to the converted here when you're saying the cost of doing nothing when it comes to transitioning to net zero is significantly higher than getting on with it. And I think that's a very clear message. Now, I said to you that at the start we were going to have a panel discussion, but when I look at the questions, and they keep on coming in very quickly, we got a lot of questions. So I would suggest we start looking at some of the questions, starting with Toby. Toby, but we all know, I'm sure, Toby Harris, and he was quickly off the mark in the question, I think, saying, what is the balance of spending on infrastructure resilience between making existing assets resilient as compared to spending on resilience on new assets? I'll start with Catherine. Catherine, from a water perspective especially, and you don't ask me a question back from an electricity perspective. To hear your view on that, on the balance. You know, how much money do we spend on building
I think
assets as compared to new assets?
I'm not sure I'd pose the question in quite that way, to be honest. I mean, I think there's a prior question which is really difficult, which is about what is the level of resilience that we are aspiring to, and can we be honest about what that is? And we find that all the time in the water sector, where people quite reasonably assume that there will always, in every circumstance, be clean, wholesome drinking water coming out of the tap, and everybody will always be able to flush the loo and have the waste taken away. And that is not actually the reality. And if you want that as the reality, then it really costs quite a lot of money. So I think you have to start with that clarity around what actually are you trying to aspire to in terms of level of resilience. And then I think the question is about what is the most efficient way of delivering that level of resilience. And if it's building new assets, it's building new assets. And if it's repairing old assets, it's repairing old assets. But I think you have to start from what you're trying to achieve and then work out the most efficient way of delivering that target level of resilience, if I can put it that way.
Catherine? Sorry, Rachel.
You mean me?
Sorry, Rachel.
Kind of guessing that's what you must have meant. That's fine. It's fine. I mean, I guess just to pick up really on from where Catherine just left off there, I think I would agree. I would suggest that we have not, over past decades, been thinking about resilience, and specifically climate resilience, in the way that we've needed to. So I think there is a lot of work to do, and I suppose I'm drawing on transport systems and network expertise to answer this one. If you think about the national, the regional, the local assets that are out there that need to be a part of that system going forward, we have not got a handle at the moment on the state of that whole asset and what we need to do. And that, of course, is the first job, isn't it, really? I think we can all agree that we all want to sort of live in a place that has all these infrastructure systems up and running and so on. But perhaps we do need to have some really difficult conversations and do the thinking around, what actually is going to be acceptable going forward, what is more important, because of course it's not just within one of the infrastructure sectors, it's across them as well. And there's very often one affects the other as well, which is very inconvenient.
Okay, I'm not going to go through and ask every panelist to answer the question, because too many questions, and I want to try and address. So the next one, which has come from Jim Coleman, in relation of the balance, given that we've all gone through the pandemic and governments globally are not exactly flushed cash, but we're talking about significant investment in infrastructure. What should the balance be between private and public capital coming to work? And it sort of comes back to what I think Catherine talked about in ensuring that investors can earn a reasonable return. Because again, my view is there's an abundance of cash globally ready to be put to work. It's just a matter of making sure that the regulatory regime is adequate, that enables a reasonable return. So, Bridget, what's your view on the balance between private and public capital?
I think there's two big aspects to that. There's maintaining investment in existing infrastructure assets. And, you know, we've got water companies, for example. I'm on the board of one as well in Northumbria. And how we make sure that that can be maintained and that the regulatory regime works for those existing infrastructure assets. And that, I think, is this question of what does the long term look like and how do we get a longer term thinking into things like resilience, investing in longer term futures, innovation and so on. Regulators can't innovate. Regulators may can facilitate innovation, but companies do the innovation. Companies have the idea. They can deliver technologies. But the other aspect to that is, of course, investment. How do you invest in new technologies? And how do you manage that? And how do you encourage people to do that? And I think that what we haven't mentioned so far is the establishment of the National Infrastructure Bank. I think that's going to be crucial. It was a recommendation that came out of the National Infrastructure Commission, so we were particularly pleased that that got picked up. It's now beginning to get its feet under the table, if you like, appoint its teams, beginning to be able to look at projects. And getting there is the place where some of that balance will really set the framework for how we set a balance between private investors and the returns that they need to make in order to facilitate that investment, and the bits that the taxpayer have to come in on in order to support that, or to support local authorities in bringing those things forward. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all balance. There isn't a one-size answer to this question. Everything is going to have to be pragmatic and practical, and project and program by project and program. And if too often, I think we try and get it all. And one of the interesting things for the Infrastructure Bank is how it copes with failure. Businesses fail. Investments don't always work. New things don't always deliver what you hoped that they would deliver. The public sector hates that. But we have to be able to get around the idea that many things fail. And that's okay. It's all right. Don't worry, guys. It's within a portfolio. Not everything will work.
Thank you. Thanks, Bridget. Again, just moving on. Question for you, Rachel. It's my choice to be you. It's not David Austin. David just asked the question. We seem to be focusing, when it comes to decarbonising heat, we seem to be focusing too much on heat pumps and ignoring the possible other forms of heating, which will still get us to net zero. Do you agree?
As a proud heat pump owner.
Solution, only solution, or there are other alternatives?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? I had a glitch there, but as the proud owner of a heat pump of some 3 years vintage, I'm going to keep talking and I hope you can hear me. So I don't disagree. I think there is a key focus on the heat pump side of things at the moment. I think it is right to a certain extent, but we mustn't forget there are going to be other solutions out there as well, and we absolutely should be looking at them. One of the areas, in fact, that David's mentioned further on in his question that I can see at least is actually that there are ways in the interim at least to make an awful lot of the existing boilers that are out there work much more efficiently, and there is some really interesting and really quite straightforward stuff we could actually be doing that would, in the interim, not the long-term solution clearly, but in the interim at least, reduce down the energy use associated with millions of boilers that are out there at the moment. So there might well be some other things we can do to sort of help the problem in the meantime, but I do think that we need to get a handle on what the range of likely solutions is likely to look like. I think heat pumps, we need it feels like we need some more, perhaps it might sound a bit unfair, but slightly more sophisticated thinking in terms of what solutions really look like for communities and specific areas, rather than expecting every householder to go and make an individual decision, which is actually quite difficult to do given the nature of the change we're talking about.
So if I could just come in there, one of the things that I'm particularly keen that we do at the Infrastructure Commission is pull some of this stuff together around some of the, what's best practice for what sort of place. So David talks about infrared heating. I've installed one of those in a property, and it works, but it's not necessarily the right solution where you've already got a radiator system. So because you then reinfect, but it may be very good where you've got night storage heaters. So I think it's not a one size fits all. The vast majority is gas in this country. So it's not surprising that we're focusing on the replacement of those gas systems. But district heating may actually be quite appropriate. Ground source districts can work quite well. So district heating, using ground source, Kenza are leaders in that sort of space. I'm trying to make sure we pull all of this together. There are these Warmstone things. Bays have just given 100,000 to an outfit called Warmstone or Caldera. Can't remember. Anyway, there are a number of them. So there's a lot of experimentation going on, and we've got to make sure that we pick up all of it.
Okay, Catherine, one for you from Jan, where she talks about strong incentives and good practical guidance, normally the drivers for change. Do you think we, from a regulatory perspective, we have adequate incentive to encourage change and investment?
Gosh, I suppose I'm honour bound to say no, because there's always more that could be done. But I think the question is a good one, because I think the essence of it is that this is a problem that has multiple solutions. There are a lot of different levers that need to be pulled to get us moving in the right direction at the pace that we need to move. So yes, we definitely do need strong incentives. And if you're trying to change the way that companies do things, particularly if they are sort of utility companies who quite understandably are relatively risk averse, and that's not a bad thing in a utility company. But if you are trying to get them to change the way that they do things, you possibly do need to move the needle a little bit further in terms of the incentives to get that to happen. Absolutely. We need strong guidance. Yes. What's expected? What is okay? What is encouraged? What's not okay? That's very helpful. But I go back to this point about long-term frameworks. That's absolutely critical. You can have as strong as incentive regime as you like, and if you drop off a cliff in 5 years' time, it just won't work, because a lot of the stuff that we need to be doing to meet climate change resilience, to meet net zero, and in fact to meet the levelling up agenda is not something that is one and done in a 5-year period. It's going to require us to map out a trajectory over 20, 25, 30, 40 years, confident that the company, the regulators, the other stakeholders are all holding hands on that long-term journey, so that we can be confident that actually, we know what the road is going to look like as far as possible. There will always be bumps, but there's a lot that regulators can do to take away the uncertainty that isn't actually necessary, that is just a function of the way the regime works. And I think that's for my money, that's the biggest change I would like to see.
Thank you. Just the comment on the regulatory incentive. In regulation generally, I think here in the UK, we probably have one of the best regulatory regime, whether it's water, energy, telecommunication, I think, in the world. And when you look around the world, we tend to, the rest of the world follows the UK, which is a good place to be. Now, as we head towards the end of the hour, I'm afraid I will need to, before passing back to Robert for the final comments, firstly, allow me to apologise, because there's a number of additional questions which we're not going to get to the stage to be able to answer. So apologies for that. Secondly, I would like to, on behalf of the audience, to thank the three speakers, Bridget, Catherine and Rachel, and for their comments and the insight in specifically the overall summary of the report, regulatory and sustainability, which, as I said, I think the discussion could have expanded for hours. So on behalf of all of us, thank you and well done. And finally, Robert, back to you.
Thank you very much, Basil. This has been a valuable and fascinating discussion. I've been personally fascinated by the comments about heat pumps, as we all have to think about that going forward, and look forward to whatever comments come out. On behalf of Resilience First and all the participants, I would like to thank Basil in the chair and the three particular speakers for their superb contributions today. But thank you also to those who take an interest in registering and also asking very interesting questions. And I'm greatly sorry that we couldn't address them all, but time comes against us. So finally, please do join us again on the 2nd of February for our second webinar of the new year, which we will be looking at how to improve urban infrastructure for better resilience, with speakers from Dubai, Cape Town and Los Angeles. So we'll see how other people seem to tackle this particular problem. So I do hope you can join us. Until then, thank you very much for listening. Stay safe and goodbye.